This is chapter 4 of your textbook. It is entitled Performances, and it begins by introducing the question, if men and women aren't naturally opposite, then why do we act so differently so much of the time? And that's because, if you recall, the entire point of chapter 3 was building up that argument that men and women aren't naturally opposite, that there aren't a lot of differences that we see between the sexes that are natural, universal, and immutable. And that was the definition that the authors were going with when it came down to depicting and describing what they called real differences between the sexes. So we ended chapter 3, basically accepting that there aren't that many differences that meet that definition. But yet, if you were to look around at a lot of men and women, in public spaces, on your campus, if we were allowed to be on campus, in your private spaces, you perhaps would feel like you observe men and women and boys and girls just acting very differently most of the time. And so the point of this chapter is to get at that question. If we aren't acting differently and we're not being different because of these kind of natural, real differences, then why are we? And really it comes down to, different choices and different practices. And that's what this chapter is going to be about, is establishing that. So consider the quote by Kimmel from the textbook. So this is a quote from your textbook, but it's by Kimmel, who I reference a lot of his ideas in this course as well, because I used to use a textbook by him. But this is from your textbook on page 69. For some of us, becoming adult men and women in our society is a smooth and almost effortless drifting into behaviors and attitudes that feel as familiar to us as our skin. And for others of us, becoming masculine or feminine is an interminable torture, a nightmare in which we must brutally suppress some parts of ourselves to please others or simply to survive. For most of us, though, the experience falls somewhere in between. All right, so we're beginning off with this quote suggesting that for some of us, this performance feels so second nature and has always felt so second nature, it might feel weird to call it a performance because you really might think, I'm just being myself. While for some others of us, it very clearly is a performance. It's a painful performance as we have to pretend to be someone that we're not. And then they note that for a lot of us, it probably is something in between. There are aspects of doing gender, as we're about to talk about, that feel really natural because they align with what we feel like is our innate impulses and personality characteristics. And there's some parts that do not feel natural, and we know they don't feel natural as we do it at the time. Like I said, I love to dress up. I'm really missing that I'm pretty much spending all my time in, a combination of pajamas and athleisure right now. I've always really liked to dress up. I've always preferred wearing dresses and skirts to pants. I mean, my parents, tell these stories about me from when I was a little kid. So that part of doing femininity has always felt natural to me. What doesn't really feel natural is being nurturing. I consider myself a considerate and generous person, but I am not motherly. I don't love children. I don't rush to pick up the babies. And when I feel like I need to do that, or when I'm trying to do that, admittedly, it does feel like a performance. And that's probably true of most of us, because keep in mind, for a lot of us, what we're doing is we're cutting that deal with dominant gender definitions. We're upholding some, we're rejecting others. And sometimes the ones that we reject, we might be put in situations where we need to pretend like we're not rejecting them. And so, in those situations, the performance aspect of it all can just become a lot more clear. So you heard me mention the concept of doing gender. And that's just the ways in which we either actively obey or break gender rules. So, what are exactly gender rules? These are the instructions for how to appear and behave as a man or a woman. These rules are socially constructed, meaning that, they can vary between societies and over time. So because I said these are the instructions for how you behave and how you appear, another two terms that I would like for you to know are gender role and gender display. Those gender rules related to behavior are what we call gender role. This is how society expects us to behave. Another way you might hear this referred to as gender norms, these expectations regarding behavior. Gender display relates to the appearance part, right? So this is how you express your gender, through displays, whether or not you wear a skirt or grow your hair out long or, groom your mustache in an interesting shape, right? All of those are what we call gender displays because all of that are displays that we expect to see on one gender and not the other. Now, why is doing gender so important to people in society? What does it help us to determine? In short, in a society comprised of people, humans, because we have low sexual dimorphism and because we have laws that pretty much in most societies prohibit us from walking around with our primary, in some cases, even some of our secondary sexual characteristics from being too much out on display, for animals that don't have a very high sexual dimorphism, gender rules allow us to quickly be able to access, engage, and determine what gender a person is. So let's break that down a little further. So I said, okay, we aren't that dramatically different. Most of our primary sexual characteristics are related to genitalia, and pretty much everywhere has laws that against exposing yourself. Then we have secondary sexual characteristics, and these are the ones that develop during and after puberty. And unlike genitalia, which although as we discussed, right, with intersex individuals, even genitalia doesn't break up along a perfect binary, but secondary sexual characteristics certainly don't, right? You have, for under guys, they have pubic, facial, body, and armpit hair. Well, you have men that are extremely hairy, that grow full, luxurious beards, and, their backs and chest are covered in hair. And then you have men that aren't very hairy, and who, if they tried to grow a beard, would be very patchy and largely unsuccessful. Similar, with women, secondary sexual characteristic, development of the breasts. In a world where there are A cups and, F cups, obviously this is something that can vary by the person. And so all that is just to say that secondary sexual characteristics don't, even when there aren't laws in place that prohibit their exposure, the fact of the matter is they still aren't a very easy way for us to be able to, quickly glance across a crowd and be like, oh, okay, there are like 10 women here and 7 men, right? We usually aren't using primary or secondary sexual characteristics data to make that eyeball assessment. So what are we using? Well, we're using people's gender displays and their gender roles. We're using the fact that they are doing gender is what allows us, therefore, to classify them as a gender. And, you might question, why is this important? But it's worth noting that although, the actual gender rules of a society might vary, it's just worth noting that all societies have differentiated along the basis of gender. So this has always been something that people feel like is somewhat important to know. And what happens when we don't know it, when we can't figure it out? When that happens, right, and we call this sexual ambiguity, right? Like we don't know what sex you are. And that's because, of course, we conflate sex and gender, oftentimes people get really confused and upset. It just shows you how much of our interactions, how much we think and how we treat people, particularly strangers, is kind of wrapped up around gender rules, right? So we really try to avoid this sexual ambiguity. A lot of us try to avoid sexual ambiguity. And it's worth noting that sexual ambiguity is not the same thing as talking about gender fluidity, which is one of the terms from one of the earlier chapters, right? When a person is gender fluid, they embrace gender rules, but they embrace the rules for men and women, and they do so on differing days or in different contexts. But usually they are, or they embrace them, as in ways that are combining the two. So they do some gender rules for women, and they do some gender rules for men. But that's not the same thing as sexual ambiguity. It is recognized as something different. And so a good way to think about it is this quote that we engage in behavior at the risk of gender assessment. And that's basically just a reminder that people are assessing us, and they are assigning us this label of being a man, woman, man, or perfect woman, or you're doing manhood wrong, be a real man, right? It's this idea that, whether or not we choose to uphold gender rules, unless we're anywhere besides the privacy of our own home, there's someone observing our upholding or not upholding these gender rules, and they are, they are assessing that, and it may, and I don't want you to think assessing means like they're going to confront you necessarily, or they're actively judging you, or they might even say something. It really could just mean like observing and noting, like, I've never seen a man cry loudly in public before by himself, right? It might just be a passing thought, or like, oh, that lady does not shave her legs, right? So it may not come with a lot of consequences, but just because it doesn't come with a lot of consequences doesn't mean it's not necessarily assessment. And so, your book notes that most of these gender rules, because they're socially constructed, they're just simple cultural agreements that this is how we expect men and women to behave. This is, what we find acceptable in terms of how men and women look. And so they discuss how gender is socially constructed through several lenses. First of all, they talk about the fact that gender rules can vary culture to culture, and they give you some examples for that, like, what's considered, acceptable physical touch among men, because there are these fears associated with homophobia, particularly for men more so than women. In America, there are these much stricter rules around like how do men touch one another. The acceptable, bro hug or fist bump or whatever. But your book notes that, there are countries like France, of course, where men give that traditional double kiss greeting on the cheek. And that's considered totally acceptable. And they mention how in Middle Eastern societies, men even, hold hands. They talk about clothing, how skirts are, predominantly for women, in the US, but certainly you have like in Scotland, there you have the kilt. And then they mention once again that in Arab countries, there's this traditional dress that's like a flowing robe that in a lot of ways, it looks just like a dress. And then they talk about how even like the color pink, which is very gendered in the US, we associate with girls, girl babies. But in some countries, it's not even gender neutral. They say it's for boys, like Belgium, for instance. So that just shows you that gender rules can vary culture to culture. But gender rules also can vary over time within a culture. And they give the earring example on page 72. 73, to kind of discuss that, within our own culture, earrings were were very rare. They were largely only seen on women of Italian and Spanish descent, and then sailors. And then over time, in the 1930s, they talked about the rise of clip-on earrings among women. And then they talked about how in the 80s, beginning with some male musicians and celebrities, you started to see men wear earrings, but there were all these kind of hidden meanings associated with whether the man was wearing one or two, and if he was wearing a one, on which ear. And so that just shows you how that gender roles can vary over time within a culture. And then finally, gender definitions vary within a culture at one time. And particularly, they talk about, what this means in terms of subcultures, the fact that we have smaller cultures that exist under the umbrella of a larger dominant culture. So if you think about, the larger dominant culture here in the US, there's subcultures like, cowboy slash ranch, goth. There are cultures related to religion like Amish or Quakers or Mormons. Cultures can be related to, nationalities or nations of origin, right? So Hispanic American culture. So all of these are subcultures because they exist at the same time within the larger dominant culture. And the gender roles in those subcultures can be different in some aspects, or in a lot of aspects even, from dominant culture. And so a person who is going back and forth between like their subculture or subcultures plural and larger dominant culture are engaging in what is called cultural traveling. And so they have to be savvy about, the gender rules that exist, the cultural rules in general, but we're focusing specifically on gender. But the fact that different rules can exist in all of those different subcultures and contexts, and so as they culturally travel, they have to be aware of, are they following the correct set of rules?